Great to welcome you back to Montgomery United Methodist Church and our online worship series. Today we're finishing up with the book of Nehemiah, and there's some great insight yet in store. Just want to continue to encourage you to be joining in as part of our celebration on this Sunday, and we're giving thanks to God by sharing together canned goods and non-perishables with folks in our community. Just drop those by, please, today or tomorrow morning, and we'll be sure to pass them along to folks in need. We're just delighted to be with you today and looking forward to see what God will do among us as we worship.
Come thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount time fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above.
In our scripture lesson today, Nehemiah comes back to check on things. Things had already been completed, things had already been set in place. Revival had come to the nation, and now, after being away for a while, Nehemiah returns to see how things are continuing to develop. And we pick this story up in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verses 15 through 22. In Nehemiah's own words. In those days I saw men of Judah treading out their wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in grain, loading it on donkeys, and bringing their wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of produce to Jerusalem to sell on the Sabbath. So I rebuked them for selling their produce on that day. Some men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise. They were selling it on the Sabbath to the people of Judah, and in Jerusalem at that. So I confronted the nobles of Judah. Why are you profaning the Sabbath in this evil way? I asked. Wasn't it just this sort of thing that your ancestors did that caused our God to bring all this trouble upon us and our city? Now you are bringing even more wrath upon Israel by permitting the Sabbath to be desecrated in this way. Then I commanded that the gates of Jerusalem should be shut as darkness fell every Friday evening, and not to be opened until the Sabbath ended. I sent some of my own servants to guard the gates so that no merchandise could be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and tradesmen with a variety of wares camped outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I spoke sharply to them and said, "What are you doing out here, camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and to guard the gates in order to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath. Remember this good deed also, O my God. Have compassion on me according to your great and unfailing love. This week, I've been discovering the writings of Tracy Mitchell. She's a writer of devotional materials that seem to be intended mostly for women, but Even a man like me can learn something. And I have been very encouraged and challenged by her work, and think that Ms. Mitchell perfectly describes the situation in chapter 13 of Nehemiah, the very last chapter of the book. In her words, are you ever tempted to take the easy route around a sticky situation? At times it seemed like a good option to me, but I knew if I make the decision to do what was convenient and comfortable, then I would regret it. Thankfully, I received wise counsel from friends who encouraged me to take the longest route and wait on God's best. The enemy doesn't always set traps to make us feel uncomfortable. Sometimes the trap is to make us comfortable in places where we should never settle down. We grow roots when instead we should be growing wings. Not everything that entices us away from God's perfect plan appears to be evil. Sometimes the trap is set in a way that appears neither good nor evil, but surprisingly comfortable. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 encourages, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and God will make your paths straight. Kind of like the way Mr. Peterson renders this in the Message paraphrase. Trust God from the bottom of your heart. Don't try to figure out everything on your own. Listen for God's voice in everything you do, everywhere you go. He's the one who will keep you on track. My old friend Dolores was very fond of this verse from Song of Songs, chapter 2. Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom. I remember many times when we'd be in a dilemma and Dolores would understand that we'd been caught up in the details and not in a good way. And she'd put one finger in the air and say, the little foxes. And it was a reminder to us that obviously little foxes might be cute little things, and they seem very harmless at first, but if those things are not corrected, they could lead to trouble. No parent, for instance, wants to raise a child that continuously tells lies. But when your 4-year-old is sitting next to a pile of candy wrappers with chocolate all over her face and telling you, Daddy, I didn't eat the candy, it's adorable at first blush, of course. But if you add on 10 years, that lying, deception, and a lack of integrity builds on one another, one deed after the other, and can develop into a real problem. And so, you gently correct that dishonesty and reward truthfulness. Now, Nehemiah chapter 13, the last chapter of the book, the big finish, the huge conclusion, ought to be a story of great festivity. There should be a huge party going on to close out this amazing book of the Bible, because it is a story of the triumph of God's people. They restore the city walls of Jerusalem. They begin to bring the temple back to its former glory. And not only do they experience incredible community accomplishment, but you remember that they also realized spiritual renewal as well. Back in 1 Samuel 7 and verse 12, we see the prophet Samuel himself taking a stone and setting it between the cities of Mizpah and Shen, and called it the name of Ebenezer, saying, "Hitherto hath the Lord helped us." That's what we sang about earlier. Here I raise my Ebenezer. Here I raise a stone that declares God's glory. Here I raise a monument to God's goodness. And that's what should have been happening. It did happen in chapters 8 and 9 of Nehemiah. They recounted all of the faithfulness and the mercies of God as one together. They commemorated God's faithfulness throughout their history. But you might also remember in that same hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." It contains some of the most plain-spoken lyric in any Christian song. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it. You see, that's what we're seeing lived out in the last chapter of Nehemiah. It's a compromised life. I enjoyed hearing Pastor Ben Stewart talking about chapters 8 and 9 of Nehemiah and comparing that time to the last night of church camp. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to church camp in the summers of your youth, but here's kind of the way it went on Friday night. It was a time of great rejoicing. You thought about all that you had learned. You thought about the great experiences. You thought about how close you felt to God. You were experiencing the wonder of the friendships that you had made throughout that week of camp. And on Friday night, it came to a wondrous climax and an incredible celebration. Paul Aldrich describes it as happening rather in this way. I love you all so much, and I will write you every day for the rest of my life. That's a great representation of Friday night at summer camp. You're so close to that group of people. You feel so close to God during that week. It's a mountaintop experience, and you want to hold on to it for every day. And you promise one another, we're going to be like this every day for the rest of our lives. And then you go home from camp the next day, and your little brother is still annoying you. And you find out that while you were away at camp, your parents straightened up your room. And your best friend that you could hardly wait to tell about your week had left on their own vacation that morning, and you missed them entirely. And in no time at all, you're just ready to explode on someone, to leave out that frustration, to vent all those feelings. And parents, being who they are, would say something like, "Hey, where's the camp love?" And your response is, if you're like me, to just stomp off to your room and not want to see anybody for a couple of hours. It's hard to hold on to that feeling. It's hard to hold on to that enthusiasm. It's hard to sustain that energy. And again, Tracy Mitchell How's the word of wisdom for that? The habits that you currently have are only good enough to get you what you've currently got. If you don't change a habit, then you will go right back to where you are. You don't dive into unhelpful behavior. You just kind of slide back in to those old patterns. And so for the people of Judea, 3 very familiar issues surfaced once again. First, they allowed the culture around them to dictate their values. It was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And if you and I blindly follow in the same standards and behaviors that we see all around us, it is easy for us to be led astray. We need to be thoughtful, considerate, pondering decisions we're making. Does it honor God, or is it just the path of least resistance? The nation also neglected to be faithful in supporting the temple. They weren't scornful of worshiping. They weren't scornful of supporting the house of God. They just didn't think about it. It wasn't a priority. They got lazy. And as a result, the temple started to look a little shabby, and the Levites, who weren't getting paid, stopped working at the temple and went back out and started farming again, which made everything worse. In the New Testament period, worship was on the first day of the week, and offerings were encouraged to be set aside then before other priorities squeezed out the potential to be generous in your gifts to God. You can only be generous if you thought about it while you had the money. If you waited, then you ended up giving to God only what was left over. God deserves better than our leftovers. But in Nehemiah's Judea, the people began to see the Sabbath as just another day, which turned out to be then an extra day to work. On July 29th, 2019, Business Insider published a feature entitled, it's a long title, "Chick-fil-A likely loses out on more than $1 billion in sales every year by closing on Sundays." $1 billion in sales lost because they close on Sundays. And the second part of the title is, "And it's a brilliant business decision." Now, it seems like a ridiculous business choice, particularly when you know that McDonald's restaurants do the equivalent of 2 days of sales on Sundays, 2 weekday sales on 1 day on Sunday, when Chick-fil-A isn't even open. So it seems like a horrible business choice that Chick-fil-A would be closed on Sunday. But this was not a decision based on economics. But, well, let founder Truett Cathy explain. Closing our business on Sunday, the Lord's Day, is our way of honoring God and showing our loyalty to Him. Is this a decision that goes against the culture? Absolutely. Is it a decision that honors God? No question. Has Chick-fil-A's business suffered? Well, you decide. Because as it is right now, Chick-fil-A is the 3rd largest restaurant chain in America. So, and we need to kind of move quickly now. How did Nehemiah respond to these challenges in order to establish positive long-range behavior? Number one, he faced the wrong head on. The Levites had been forced to return to farming when they were no longer being financially supported by working in the temple. And so what did Nehemiah do? I reprimanded the leaders. Why is God's temple being neglected? So I brought the Levites back together and put them back in their places of service. That's head on. Secondly, Nehemiah faced the issues decisively. He discovered that the high priest had allowed Tobiah to live in the temple complex, even though he didn't belong there. You might recognize the name of Tobiah. He's the same guy back in chapter 4 who had taunted Nehemiah by saying, that stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked on top of it. Nehemiah's reaction when he discovered that Tobiah was living in a place where he didn't belong, which would then have excluded others who rightfully should have been living there. I was furious. So I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Nehemiah didn't just order someone else to do his dirty work. He went down there and he physically removed everything himself. That's decisive. Thirdly, Nehemiah outlined a positive alternative to the inappropriate behavior. You see, this is not just a temper tantrum for Nehemiah. Nehemiah is interested in enacting significant reform. And lastly, he followed up with prayer. This seems odd. But you can guess what happened when Nehemiah instituted these reforms. His old buddies likely said to him, "Hey, Nehemiah, what's wrong, man? Why are you so grumpy these days?" But Nehemiah does not lose focus. His prayer, God, I have done my best. Please don't allow me to sink into self-righteousness. Please don't allow me to think that I'm better than everybody else. Please don't let me to put myself up on a pedestal and look down on others. Keep me humble. And please don't allow the positive things that I have accomplished to end as soon as I leave town again. It ultimately does not depend on me, Lord. Please use the work that I have done, not so that I will be wealthy or famous, but so that my life will have significance, so that I can see that I have invested my life well. Nehemiah had started this whole project with prayer all the way back in chapter 1, and he bookends his work here again with prayer. Now, I don't have to convince you of Ludwig van Beethoven's significance in music history. He's one of the most accomplished composers to have ever lived. He was a young prodigy. He played in his organ in church at 13 years of age. He was a concert master. He was a wonderful and profligate composer. But he was not a stranger to difficulties. During his 20s, Beethoven began to lose his hearing. But also, his fingers, as he described it, became thick. He couldn't feel the music as he once had. His hearing haunted him in the middle years of his life, but he kept his hearing loss a well-guarded secret. When Beethoven reached his 50s, he was stone deaf. And yet 3 years later, he made what turned out to be a tragic attempt to conduct an orchestra and failed miserably. He was deaf and yet a magnificent musician. On one occasion, Beethoven was overheard shouting at the top of his voice as he slammed both fists down on the keyboard, "I will take life by the throat." And it's that determination that made Beethoven successful when things were good, and successful also when things were horrible. And so now let's revisit Tracy Mitchell. The habits that you currently have are only good enough to get you what you've currently got. If you don't change a habit, then you will go right back to where you are. And so our challenge is, how can we respond as Nehemiah did? What issue in your life do you need to face head on? No putting it off, no explaining it away. As one of my old bosses told me, "John, it's not going to get any easier, just more difficult." Where do you need to act decisively? And why do you hesitate? What is the behavior that you have become caught up in that needs to be replaced with a positive alternative? It's not enough to just say, "I've avoided this, I've avoided that." Well, what positive thing have you undertaken instead? Lastly, how can you find more time to be listening to God? And in what location and at what time of day is that best possible? One last word from Tracy. In the secret places with God, we remember God's faithfulness. We remind ourselves of God's promises and gain both strength and endurance to overcome even the most difficult trials. You might think that's easy to say, but Tracy understands what she's talking about. She is a 2-time survivor of stage 4 cancer. So, okay, now it's your move.
Oh my, that the highest King would welcome me. I was lost, but He brought me. Oh, His love for me. Oh, His love for me.
So the onus is on us at this juncture, because church only begins as we worship. Church only takes effect as we live out God's calling. And so let's take the challenges that Nehemiah set before us today and go forth to show the difference that God's love makes and to make a difference in God's name. See you next week.